especially when you look at it from a perspective that it was only 1300 years ago that by you even shedding a tear for Imam al-Hussein, you risked execution.
Wow. Was that bad?
Baba,
Yes.
Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, when he would hold the azaa of Imam al-Hussein in the house, he said, the police of Bani Abbas, of Bani Umayyah would come into the house and say, what are you all people crying? And we have inside of the hadith, that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam would say, tell to them that a small infant has died in our house, meaning Abdullah al-Radhi'. Inside of the West, in any Western country, even take a Western country that is mole-head, Aslan, propagating atheistic behavior. But you cannot be in that same situation that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was. We have relatively more freedom now to cry, to establish centers, to establish TV. At that time, if you were seen weeping for Imam al-Hussein, Baba, that's an execution order. So we have to realize the value of this relative freedom that we're enjoying. And this freedom is a result of the efforts of those scholars before us. As a result of those pioneers before us, it is those gradual efforts over the last hundreds of years that has got us to this place. And if we don't take advantage of this, then there is nothing that we have to pass on to the coming generation. What do we have to ask ourselves? What heritage are we going to leave for the future generation to come? That they carry the flag of Imam al-Hussein forward. Are we giving them more than what we inherited? Or are we reducing the efforts of those at the back and regressing? So these guys are going to start 5 steps back than where we were when we started. It is through the donations of our viewers, through PayPal, through credit card, through debit card, pledges that you have.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm sure all of you will agree with me that one of the most controversial topics within the Holy Quran concerns slavery. Because slavery is one of those aspects in society, one of those conditions in society that virtually everybody looks at in a negative way. When we watch films, for example, which depict slaves and the treatment of slavery, it brings about a great sadness, brings about a sense of being uncomfortable when you see the way people are treated as slaves in the history of humanity. And so therefore you find that there are many movements in the 21st century which seek to abolish slavery once and for all. You always hear about campaigns where people seek to abolish slavery in every form, whether it's political slavery that sometimes exists, economic slavery that exists, slavery in the sense where people's rights have been taken away from them, and a sense of inequality in society, where a person looks at some people and says, you're born to be free and you're born to be a slave. And therefore you find that since time immemorial, this has been an issue which every great thinker, philosopher, even heads of religion have all sought to find in one way or the other a solution for. Do we abolish outright? Do we eradicate slavery completely? What do we do if we live in a society that already finds slavery part and parcel of their culture, part and parcel of their customs, part and parcel of their economy? How do you, for example, walk into Mecca, where we know that somebody like Bilal had lived a life as a slave for years. What do? All of a sudden just say, that's it, we abolish slavery? We found that slavery existed in Greece, and hence you have Aristotle and Plato discussing slavery. We found, for example, prophets such as Musa, Isa, all having to discuss slavery in one way or the other. There's slaves all over Egypt at the time when Moses is growing up. There's slavery in the time of Christ. And that's why I do find it sometimes surprising when non-Muslims from the people of the book, from the Jews and the Christians, attack Islam about its stance on slavery, when we know very well that a person can look throughout the Bible and find that, for example, of the curses of Ham from the children of Noah was the fact that there would be people who would be slaves forever. Because you know in the Bible there's that discussion in the book of Genesis where the sons of Nuh alayhi salam, they see him drunk in the vineyard. And they come and they try and cover up their father and so on. But one of the curses that happens to one of the sons, where there's no prophets to come from his line, is that slavery is to come in his line. And so even non-Muslims have these discussions within their texts concerning slavery. There isn't a prophet of God, one may argue, but they had to encounter slavery in one form or another. And we face a couple of predicaments, epistemologically speaking, in looking at this topic. This is not an easy topic. This actually is a topic that brings me a sense of unease, because it really makes me question my moral worldview, especially when I'm looking at a book which is, to me, God's word. And then I find some verses in that text where I become uncomfortable when I read them. And you know, sometimes when you become uncomfortable when you read these verses, you don't know what to do. Because sometimes the pulpits in our mosques won't discuss them, because you're going into a world where you're talking about females and them becoming your property. And that's why in the books of Islamic law, the slave is in chapters like Tijara and Bay', chapters of trade, merchandise and trade and buying and selling, because the slave is seen as a property. Dare I say that the slave in some cases is even in similar chapters to the animal. And this is in Islamic law. And I'm not just talking about non-Shia law. A person only has to read the works of the likes of Sheikh al-Tusi, or the likes of the author of a book like Al-Lum'a al-Damashqiyya, the Damascus Glycerine, like Shahid al-Awwal, and you'll see that within the chapters of Nikah, there is a discussion on slavery. But there's also a discussion of slavery in chapters of Bay' and Tijara. And so you become uncomfortable, because now in my worldview as a Shia, for example, I look at the Quran and I clearly see sections which talk of me possessing slaves. And I look in the world of Hadith and I can see that most of my Imams, one may argue, are the sons of slave girls. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, when he marries Hamida al-Barbariya, she is what we sometimes refer to as an Walad. Walad refers to this lady who is a slave. But of course, when her child is born, that child becomes free, in turn possibly freeing the mother. The mother doesn't get sold on. But Imam Musa al-Kadhim's mom is a slave girl. Imam al-Rida alayhi salam's mother is a slave girl. Imam al-Jawad's mother is a slave girl. Imam al-Hadi's mother is a slave girl. Imam al-Askari's mother is a slave girl. And of course, we all come on the 15th of Sha'ban and we all hear the narration of a story of a lady who originally was a slave. Previously, some mention her being a princess, but eventually she is sold. Do we agree? So when I see a chapter in Islamic law called the chapter of Bay', the chapter of Tijara, I'm looking at my own 12th Imam and I'm thinking that his own mother was also someone sold. But if the 12th Imam is born a couple of hundred years after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi died, that means slavery hadn't been abolished by the Prophet, nor by the Imams. It means that there was a position for slavery. If there was a position for slavery, which still means that in our books of fiqh there's a section on slaves, you may find maybe recently there may have been discussions about whether Ayatollah Sistani, may Allah lengthen his life, keeps that chapter on slaves. But we can't deny that we still have the mentioning of slaves on certain kafaras that we have to pay. And I'll come to that very shortly. They're still there in the answer, isn't it? So when you go to a website of a marja and you're like, okay, what do I do if I've not fasted today? Yasser, for example, if he didn't fast today, and now he's wondering, qada, kafara, fidya, what's the kafara, what's the fidya? And you see this list of things that you have to do. And what's the first thing that's always written? Free a? And you're thinking, hold on a minute. If the religion of Islam is a religion whose intention was to abolish this, why in 2021 do I still have fiqh laws that are telling me free a slave? And then what does everyone do? They jump to the next section. What's the next one? Tell me the next one. Fast 2 months in a row. Bro, forget that one. What's the next one? Feed 60 people. Straight away, phone call, Africa, Iraq, feed 60 people. But the reality is that in our books, the Quran, we always say the Quran is a book until the Day of Judgment. And of course that has its nuances. You can't just say because the Quran is a book until the Day of Judgment, that means every verse applies to every time. There are some which will, there are others which are open to discussion. So when I've seen my moral compass now, I'm asking myself a question. Deep down, when I hear that Islam didn't abolish slavery, and that Islam actually says that there's no problem with having a slave, deep down morally, what do I start thinking? What do I do? Because when a person leaves Islam, this is one of the main reasons they leave. This topic. Sometimes I'm interested when I see non-Muslims who attack the Quran and its discussion of slaves or concubines, and I see in the Bible there are many who've got concubines all around them. But then there are some people who are atheists. And I think the atheists will agree with me that whether you're the head of a religion or you're a philosopher, the debate concerning how you ensure that slavery is reformed, abolished, is always there. It's always there. But we cannot deny that it was custom in many societies. Societies that didn't even believe in God. So to say that Muslims are the only ones who accept it, look, there's societies that never believed in God. And we then deal with another moral issue before I go to the verses on slavery in the Quran. We deal with another moral issue, and that is, do you agree with me that there's certain things which were customs? Maybe customs 20 years ago and are seen as taboo today. Do you agree? So we can work on different angles. Homosexuality 40 years ago, 50 years ago was taboo. Today society has said it's accepted, especially in a couple of continents in the 7 in the world. If we look from the other hand, cousin marriages, let's start with that. Cousin marriages 20 years ago, I don't think a lot of people were batting eyelids if you married your first cousin even 40 years ago. But now, do you agree with me that when you speak to your friend and you're like, I'm married to my cousin, you might even have some Muslims who are like, how you married to your cousin? That's disgusting. And you're like, why is it disgusting? She's like my sister. Yeah, well, if the laws of hijab have been removed from all of you, then yeah, she's like your sister. But originally the laws of hijab dictate that you can't be hugging your cousin every Eid party. And at her wedding you don't go and kiss her because she is someone who's in the laws of what? Namar. So for us, when we look at this area, cousin marriages were a custom at a certain time. I'm only talking about 30 years ago. Today, you're scared to tell your workmate that, listen, I'm married to my first cousin. It's like, your first cousin? It's not that it's something forbidden. But even certain jurists look at it now and they ask the question that, listen, if it's gone on for 3 generations, 4 generations, where there are some families, by the way, they literally only marry from their cousins. And they only marry from the same village even. The cousin has to be someone right across the road. Not even a cousin like 7 continents away. And so they marry one after the other. And then medicine came and so on. How about child marriages? 30, 40, 50 years ago. Marrying someone 12, 13, 14 years old. I can show you states in America where people would do that. What I'm saying is that when we enter this discussion, we need to understand Arabia wasn't alone in having slavery as a custom where the people found it normal. All the Prophet is doing is living within a custom which is seen as being normal, but where he wants possibly a rethinking of the way you deal with this class of society. In the same way, I may have lived in a particular society and I see the customs of this society. Likewise, my Prophet literally is one of Mecca. He's one of Medina. The area of slavery most people have an issue in, and I'm going to go to in the Quran right now. The area of slavery most people have an issue with is the captives of war, I think. I think the other areas a lot of people don't have an issue with. Most people have an issue with the verses that say, and what your right hands possess. وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. Before we get to that area, how many different words are there for slave in the Quran? Which goes to show you that we're not talking about one particular category. In the Quran, there are a number of words for slave. Give me one word, for example, for slave in the Holy Quran. What would you say is one of the words for slave in the Quran? Abd. You agree? Abd is a word for slave in the Quran. If you look in Surah 16, Hajj Yasir, verse number 75 of the Holy Quran, you'll see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word abd for slave. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala state? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ضرب الله مثلا عبدا مملوكا لا يقدر على شيء. Okay? So here God says, I put forward the similitude of 2 men. One of them is what? Abdan. Slave. We agree? That's why in Salah, look how beautiful this is. In the Quran, God uses the word slave. At the time in Arabia, Abd, they look at him low. Allah in Salah looked at the Abd and said, he is the highest. In Sujood, you go down as an Abd, you become the highest. Whereas in Arabia, an Abd was seen as the lowest. In Tashahhud, we said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi a few nights ago. What did I say? أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده. Subhanallah. The word Abd for slave in Arabia, suddenly God's Prophet is called Abd. So we have the word Abd. Which other word for slave in the Quran? Who can show me another word for slave in the Quran? Because it's interesting that most Muslims, if you ask them what is the word for slave in the Quran, they'll say to you Abd. But further than that, they don't mention any others. If I find, for example, in the Quran, sadaqah has to be given to freeing a slave, what would that word be? Anyone remember any verses about freeing a slave? Look at the verse, for example, in Surah 9, verse 60. Yes, well done. Raqabah. Surah 9, verse number 60 of the Quran. God mentions another word for the slave in Arabian society. In Surah 9, verse number 60, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, there are these categories for zakat. إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب. Zakat is to be given to the poor and the needy and those who work in the administration of the distribution of zakat, and those whose hearts are inclined, and who? And the ransoming of the slave. Or in this sense, the captive. Okay? Because you may have a slave, works in your household. You may have a slave who's a captive. Do you remember when I spoke about the issue of the dhihar? You are to me like the back of my mother. In Surah Al-Mujadala, when the man would say to his wife, you're to me like the back of my mum. The kafara would mention the freeing of a slave. In Surah 58, go to Surah Al-Mujadala, Surah 58 of the Quran, verse number 3. And by this time, my dear brothers and sisters, we're only on night 24 of the Holy Quran, and I know that all of you are flowing in finding the verses. Surah 58, verse number 3 of the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالَّذِينَ يُظَاهِرُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ ثُمَّ يَعُودُونَ لِمَا قَالُوا فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. Those who abandon any of their wives through dhihar, and then they recall what they've uttered, they may free a slave. Okay? So here we see tahrir raqaba. So another word for slave in the Quran, what's the first word we said for slave in the Quran? Abd. Second word for slave in the Quran, raqaba. Third word, if I have a female slave working for me at home, yes? That female who's working for me at home, what's her name in the Quran? Amma. Sometimes you may see an ayah, وَأَنْكِحُ الْأَيَامَ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ. Sometimes in the Quran, for example, Baqarah Surah 2, verse 221. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 221, you have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us another of the names for the slave in the house. Okay? وَلَا تَنْكِحُ الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنَّ. Do not marry an idol worshipper. Why can I not marry a mushrika? Say I can marry maybe the people of the book, Christian and Jewish. Let's say maybe. But here the Quran says you cannot marry someone who mushrik. I cannot marry, for example, some people ask, why can we not marry Hindu or Sikh or Buddhist, for example? And they mention other religions as well. Some of these don't believe in God at all. Some of these believe in one God, but they put partners to God, or they put images of God. This is the ayah. وَلَا تَنْكِحُ الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنَّ. Do not marry an idol worshipping woman until what? Until they believe. وَلَا أَمَةٌ مُؤْمِنَةٌ خَيْرٌ مِّن مُشْرِكَةٍ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَتْكُمْ. A believing female slave. Sometimes the translation is bondswoman. A believing female slave for you to marry. Interesting. For you to marry. Interesting. Rather than maybe just the idea that she is my slave, that means she is my property. It's interesting that the word nikah is mentioned here. Because the main debate will come later on. If she's your property, do you need nikah? But here is interesting. وَلَا تَنْكِحُ الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنَّ وَلَا أَمَةٌ مُؤْمِنَةٌ خَيْرٌ مِّن مُشْرِكَةٍ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَتْكُمْ وَلَا تُنْكِحُ الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنُوا. So here comes another section of slave. What sections do we have now? We mentioned the word abd. We mentioned raqaba. We've mentioned amma. These are all different groups in Arabian society. You may have qambar working in your house. You may have, for example, fidda working in your house. You may also have situations where Prophet marry girls like this. Nabi Ibrahim, what was Hajar? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Can we agree that some of his wives were not captured from war, but were rather given to him as a gift, such as Maria al-Qibtiyya, Mary the Coptic. Okay? So what we have is that Arabia, clearly, look what's happening. I see abd, I see raqaba, I see amma. Clearly this society is one where part of the custom is that you have these slaves at home. Bilal al-Habashi was a slave. Who was he the slave of? Umayyah. Okay? Bilal was the slave of Umayyah. We all agree? Umayyah treated Bilal well. When Bilal was the person looking after the temple, did Umayyah treat him well? Umayyah used to look after his whole family. It didn't mean you had to be Muslim to treat a slave well. You could have been a Meccan, Qurayshi, and you have a slave like Bilal. You've seen Bilal grow up. You've seen Bilal's parents grow up as your slaves in the house. He used to treat Bilal the best of ways. That's why he got so angry when Bilal converted. Bilal, what did I ever do wrong to you? You're my black Abyssinian slave. What did I do wrong to you for you to join that magician's way? But that magician, who you call a magician and we call Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he was the one who was coming to try and bring some ethics to this custom. One group of Muslim scholars want to push the idea that there's a theory that he wants to abolish, but it'll take time. Others saying that no, it's a custom, slavery. It can exist in some contexts and in other contexts, no. But the main thing is that the way you deal with such people has to be ethical. Notice that the Quran started to say to us that there are certain acts where there's a kafara if you do not what? If you do not perform them properly. So for example, I just mentioned about those who call their wives, you are to me like the back of my mum. When I mentioned Surah Al-Mujadala, those who say, you are dhihar to me, okay? These people, what's their kafara? Free a slave. We're not gonna outright abolish slavery. But we certainly are gonna find ways in which maybe we can make conditions less harsh. Maybe we can free some slaves and allow them to find their freedom. Maybe others are happy where they're living. You know, maybe there are some who are living in houses where they're like, listen, I'm a slave, but I'll tell you what, I probably live a better life than you do. But you found that some of the kafara that would be there within the Holy Quran would start to be instituted seemingly with the Prophet maybe not wanting to abolish outright, but somehow trying to bring more equilibrium in society. That you know what, if you do, for example, something unintentionally wrong, then you have to pay what? You have to pay a particular kafara. And you'll see in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell us on numerous verses about how a kafara has to be paid, for example, which we see in the books of law. We see, for example, that if you miss a fast, then what do you have to do? You have to free a slave. Someone says, Sayyidina, which slaves? I'm saying at that time, because I've got to also put my 7th century thinking caps on when I'm seeing the discussion of slavery. If I'm living in Mecca, it's normal to have slaves everywhere. Yes, we now reach a situation in the 21st century where most of the world does not have any slaves. But while I'm living in Mecca, I can see that A, kafara. B, righteousness. One of the means of being righteous was to free a slave. We all want to be with the abrar on the day of judgment. Yes? I want to be with the abrar. And therefore I ask the question, what is birr? What is righteousness? Sometimes I find an ayah of the Quran telling me, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. The Quran sometimes tells me, you'll never achieve righteousness until you give away that which you love the most. Sometimes the Quran addresses the Arabs and says, you know what real righteousness is? Not how much you pray or how much you fast, but that there are certain acts, if you perform them, they are acts of righteousness. One of them concerns slavery. Surah 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 177. In Surah 2, verse 177, we find God addressing those who define righteousness literally as salah. The more I pray, the more righteous I am. But how many do you know who pray their salah but are some of the most vicious people? Ammar bin Sa'ad as an example in Karbala. Yes? Or others in Safin, or others in Jamal. Vicious people. But they'll fight Ahlul Bayt and they prayed. They just prayed. Surah 2 verse 177, what did it say? لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Righteousness isn't that you turn your faces towards the east and the west. وَلَكِنَّ الْبِرَّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ. Righteousness is the one who believes in Allah. Tick. وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. And the day of judgment, the last day. وَالْمَلَائِكَةِ. And the angels. وَالْكِتَابِ, the book. وَالنَّبِيِّينَ, the prophets. وَآتَ الْمَالَ, the social side of Islam. Don't come to me only praying and fasting and you are a stingy human being. Don't come to me praying and fasting and you don't care about others in the society who may have been going through difficult years. What does the Quran say? وَآتَ الْمَالَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ, and that you give away the wealth out of love, not out of obligation. Because there's some of us, only if it's wajib we give. Only if it's wajib. Zakat al-fitr, ahsant. When the fitrah comes at the end of this month, yallah, I suppose I have to give. Baba, what do you mean I have to give? Give more! There are so many poor people in the world. Sayyidina, how much is it? £3.71 per household? Yallah. I will give, we have 6 in the house, that will be £21.33. I'm giving you 22, give me 67 pence back. The Quran wanted us to be those who are generous. Now imagine this in Arabian society where the Arab is thinking, righteousness is that I pray. The Quran says that's not righteousness. Righteousness is that you check off the usul ad-din, you tick them off, and also that you give out of your wealth to who? To the near ones, to the orphans, to the poor, to the one traveling and he's got lost, got no money, to who? The needy, and to those who are enslaved. So therefore, when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alih is looking at this, the Holy Prophet is trying to look at a custom in Arabia. And when he's looking at this custom, he's encouraging people get married to, marry the slave girl. You find that there's these traditions which we collect that if you free a slave, heaven is guaranteed for you. Then you see other traditions where, you know what some companions were doing? They have a slave at home. They free her and then marry her. I now free you. And now I want to marry you. I don't want you to look at yourself as still a slave. No, you're freed. And now I want to marry you. And there's this wonderful discussion which I've discussed in my lectures in the past when Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam is asked by Yahya bin Aktham that famous question, what's the kafara for someone who goes hunting while in the state of ihram? What's the kafara for someone who goes hunting while in the state of ihram? And Imam al-Jawad says, it's a vague question. He goes to him, what do you mean? Imam al-Jawad's only about 9 at the time. He goes, it's a vague question. He goes, ihram for umrah or for hajj? Daytime or nighttime? Outside Mecca, inside Mecca? Wild animal or normal animal? And this person was baffled. Then the Imam turns it around on the chief judge of Baghdad and he says to him, let me ask you a question. Who is it that in the morning was a slave, then became free, then became a slave, then became free, then became a slave, then became free, then became... Person's like, who? And then he began to explain to him. A man had a slave girl. He then freed her. And then he married her. And then he began to explain to him stage by stage of what happens. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam begins to tell the people around him that righteousness is that some of these slaves that you have, if you free them, heaven awaits you. If you free and marry them, this is even a greater reward for you. If you perform a sin, then the kafara is what? Free a slave. Isn't that true, Yasser? The kafara is free a slave, and so on and so forth. So all of us understand this at this point. And I think many people in the world appreciate that. That listen, okay, we understand that in his time, there's slavery, and he's trying to find ways in which things can be a bit more ethical between the people. Because let's face the facts. There are some countries up until 60 years ago, they had slaves in their plantations. The Holy Prophet, peace be upon his family, as I mentioned earlier, do we find that he's abolished slavery? We can't prove that because Sheikh al-Tusi and Shahid al-Awwal are still giving us laws slaves. And some of these laws, I'm not going to deny, you sometimes don't want people to go and look at some of these laws. But I can't deny that in chapters like in Kitab and Nikah, you'll see concepts such as tahleel. You know what tahleel is? When you, for example, maybe allow, because you're the master, you allow your slave to be loaned out to someone to enjoy for sex for a certain period. And, look, there are certain sections in our books of fiqh that you're looking at customs which today, as I said earlier, cousin marriages today is taboo, but a few years ago, it's normal to say, I'm married to my cousin. And I think that some of these sections in the books of fiqh, we always have people who ask us the questions, for example, about when they look at thighing, for example, and what is this idea that, a girl who isn't even baligh, a person can touch her and so on and so forth. And you look at some of these, some of them are discussed theoretically. Others of them, however, it's not theoretic. It still is in our textbooks until today. What's clear, however, is that the slave was seen as property. And that Islam somehow, even though it still accepts the slave as property, wants to give a human aspect to the existence of that creation. That doesn't deny that the laws for the slave are not the same as the law for the free. The law for the slave, for example, even the word iddah isn't used for a slave when a slave has that period before they get married. For example, they can move on in their life after a marriage. You'll sometimes see words such as istibra instead of iddah. And even the iddah period for a slave is half of that of the free person. So I'm not going to deny that the laws of the jurists who lived even after our imams, we said Imam al-Sadiq, Imam al-Kadhim, Imam al-Rada, Imam al-Jawad, Imam al-Hadi, Imam al-Askari, all married slaves. All our imams from number 7 till our 12th imam are the children of slaves. And we're proud, aren't we? I'm proud. At the end of the day, if a person's a slave, their ethics may be better than those who are called free. In this world today, wallah, there are certain people who live a life of servitude, but to Allah. And there are others who live a life of freedom, but to the shaitan. But that doesn't stop us from what ISIS did. ISIS caused a big problem. Well, ISIS caused a few problems. But of their biggest problems that they caused was when they took Yazidi girls, which Hajj Mustafa Mas'ud done a wonderful documentary on, as slaves, as their partners, wives, whatever you want to call it, property. Now, we know, do you agree that ISIS, some of their leaders know the Quran better than most of us? I think you can agree that they probably memorized the whole book, some of them. Now, we saw Nahrawan memorizing the Quran doesn't mean that you'll have love for Ahlul Bayt. But we cannot deny and just sit here and say, well, you know what, these people, all they do is read the Quran and they memorized it, but they're not good humans like me. Listen, to memorize Baqarah alone, forget the whole book, you've done all right. Unfortunately, their worldview was skewed. And how their worldview was skewed was when they started to say that these Yazidi girls, and if I'm not mistaken, not just Yazidi, who else did they take as Christians? Shia? They said the Quran says that you can have slaves. And then we reply by saying, no, the Quran says treat the slave well. And they're like, how about the right hand possession? There's 15 times I found, maybe there's more, others might correct me. 15 times in the Quran you see these ayahs, وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانِهِمْ مِلْكَ الْيَمِينَ. What your right hands possess. By the way, is there left hand marriage? This is called right hand, milk al-yamin. Is there milk al-yasar? Is there milk al-yasar? Can you have left hand marriage? Yes, you can. If you actually search online, there is a custom called the morganatic practice. Morganatic is when someone from like a royal descent marries someone of a lower status. So they're not seen as being those who can continue. Their children cannot continue and inherit the position. So they would hold them in their left hand to say that this is her position. Subhanallah. That's left hand marriage. We have right hand possession. Google it if you want. Morganatic. Morganatic. We have in the Quran all of these verses which cause us a major problem. Like, and they're so blatant, these verses, by the way. Go to Surah 23, Surah Al-Mu'minun, because all of us want to be mu'minun, true? Monty. We want to be mu'minun. We want to be of those who are counted, having done so many a'mal in the last few nights, that some of us are so dizzy at the moment. Surah 23, verse number 1 of the Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun. And everybody at home, please read with me this surah. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. Successful are the believers. أَفْلَحَ فَلَاحَ. Yep. حَيَّ عَلَى الْفَلَاحِ. Salah brings you to success. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ. Those who are humble in their salah. So that discounts about 9 of us here. No, we're all humble in our salah. Insha'Allah, Ya Rab. Insha'Allah. Although the big test is now, when the munch is there, and you see that lamb, and you've got salah. This is a huge test. Yasir. It's a major test. It's a huge test. الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ. Those who keep away from vain words. What's vain words? It's stuff like the musical. You know, people say, is there a verse about music in the Quran? This is seen as the most famous one on music. Because the words of many musicians, although in some cases it's nice, but in other cases if it contradicts Quran, that means it's vain words. Yeah. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ. And those who give zakat for purification. Okay? وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ. Those who guard their private parts. Those who guard their private parts. The signs of mu'min. Those who guard their private parts. إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ. Except for their wives. Oh God. Now we're in trouble. Now ISIS possibly has a point. You see, there's two who have a issue here. ISIS, on the one hand, we have to deal with. And those others who are like, so you're telling me that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon his family, could literally go to a battlefield. Because what we're talking about, ma malakat aymanihim, we're talking about captives of war. Illa ala azwajihim. You guard your private parts except from your wives. O ma malakat aymanuhum. Or those whom their right hands possess. Hold on. You've got men in the Muslim community saying, hold on. I've got married, but where's the right hand possession law? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is saying to me, get married, and if you have a right hand possession, then you don't guard your private parts from both of these categories. So when ISIS decided that they wanted to take the Yazidi ladies or the Shia ladies or the Christian ladies, they said in the Quran, God has given us 2 categories of marriage. Or one may argue, is it one category of marriage? Because the question here is, if the right hand possession, you have to marry them, then how comes God says those who you are your wives or your right hand possession? Aren't right hand possession under marriage? Or is it that because your right hand possession are your property, there is no need for nikah? Is that the custom in Arabia? And are there certain customs that Islam says, well, we're not going to remove that? If everybody knows that if we're going to have a punch up in battle, if I end up catching or capturing the ladies from your side, you bring them to war, it's your risk. The Prophet is dealing in what is real politics, he's dealing in real life. You see, I know that there are certain people who you'll look at and they'll want to somehow try and get the Prophet to do something else. But you know, and I'm sure, you know, Mustafa and others, I'm sure they'll agree with me that you must have come across lectures where you hear a story about one of the Prophet's marriages and you're like, hold on, how did he get married to? I'm not getting this, because like, if I look at, for example, say the Khadija, it looks like a very normal marriage. But when I look at Safiya's marriage to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alih, or Juwayriya's marriage. Now, in many of our mosques, these ladies aren't mentioned. So many times, all you know in the mosques are the likes of, Khadija and Aisha, and you might hear Salama, but the rest of the wives, we don't really hear much about. Do you agree? Okay. So you got this lady Safiya, and you've got this lady called Juwayriya. And they're both seemingly the children of people who were enemies of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon his family. And Safiya is a Jewish lady who from Khaybar, as soon as Khaybar finishes, the Prophet marries her. And you're thinking, why would he marry her? And how can he marry her that quickly? The question is the first option when you capture these ladies in war, is it straight away that you've got these 1,000 horny soldiers who just want to capture all the ladies? Because I'll be very frank with you, the way it looks is bad. When people do their research online, it looks like that some of these men, they took ladies from the opposite, take them home, and they just have relations with them. Do you agree? I'm not going to, when I say this, I say it very frankly, because if you look online, all the attacks are regarding this issue. If now the Prophet, peace be upon his family, won at Khandaq or at Khaybar or at Badr, and he's caught the prisoners, which options does he have, logically speaking? What can you tell me? What's his options? Free them. If not free them, or if free them, possibly with what? A ransom. We agree? Do they always have to pay to be freed, or could they do something else? Teach. At the beginning, we need to understand that the Prophet, peace be upon him, his family, is given this option in Surah 47, verse number 4 of the Quran. Surah 47, verse number 4 of the Holy Quran. And the option that's given is, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Everybody at home, please look at Surah 47, verse number 4. فَإِذَا لَقِيتُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَضَرْبَ الرِّقَابِ. So what happens is, when you meet those who disbelieve, smite their necks. Okay? Those who attack you, you have to defend yourself. حَتَّى إِذَا what? إِذَا أَثْقَنْتُمُوهُمْ فَشُدُّوا الْوَثَاقِ. Okay? Until when you have wounded them, making them helpless, take them as what? As captives. We agree? فَإِمَّا مَنًّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فِدَاءً. Either you set them free as an obligation, or you ransom them. They may be ransomed. Anything here mentioned about taking them and sleeping with them? Anything about sleeping with them or taking those girls? Free them or ransom them. So therefore, when we're looking at this, the Prophet had options, peace be upon his family. At Badr, when these were caught, he said, will you teach our soldiers? Yes. That's it. That's your ransom. There may have been cases where two things happen. One is that someone cannot afford a ransom. Someone says, okay, even if that person cannot afford a ransom, what's your issue having to take these ladies for yourself? Why not let them come to Medina and chill? One of the problems you face after war in any society is the possibility that somebody either becomes a prostitute or is forced into prostitution just to make money for herself and her family. There are many countries in the world today where because of war, their ladies ended up selling their bodies because they can't afford. Until today, there are people, sadly, from countries which have either seen dictatorships or seen injustice, whether it's in Arab countries like Syria, whether it's in East Europe, where ladies are literally slaves, but we don't call it slave anymore because you shouldn't. Don't mention slaves. Say that these are working girls. Say that these are earning a living. Say that these are having every right. Yeah, but every day that person's soul is dying. If we're looking at the custom at that time, there's a strong possibility that they're going to be forced into prostitution. They're not going to fend for themselves. You don't have CEO bank managers in Medina Bank who are ladies. That's not even now. Some of the most perverted shop owners in the world are Arab and Muslim shop owners. Even, you see some shops, only men are working. The lady, by the time she feels the man has undressed her. I know people who go to Pakistan. Their ladies are like, you know what, I can't even be comfortable because there's men who are working in this ladies' clothes shop. They feel uncomfortable. The custom at that time wasn't that the lady was going to be given a job. The custom at that time was they're going to look for a pimp who's going to be selling them. The Holy Prophet, peace be upon his family, if that lady or family members can ransom her, then that lady is to be ransomed. Some of these ladies, and I know, look, I know what I'm about to say is going to sound apologetic. I must admit. Some of these ladies, just meeting Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meeting the Prophet and seeing his manners, in contrast to the manners of who they were before, straight away done their shahada. Non-Muslims out there might turn around to me and say to me, this is apologetic. Look, at the end of the day, I've seen enough from my Prophet before he became a prophet where people who didn't even believe in him called him the truthful and the trustworthy. So I don't see why he would need to change his character. Safiya, there was even abuse from her husband about her character when she one day mentioned, I saw a moon fall in my lap. And he goes, you're enchanted by Muhammad. But some of these ladies, when they heard the rumors about what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to teach, they wished that they could join that religion. But how'd you get out? You belong to a group who hate religion, in some cases are mushrik, follow their own customs. So imagine when finally they are captured, some of them would say, we would prefer to live with one of you. Now, what happens if that lady, for example, is still married to someone mushrik? You know, if you are a mushrik and your wife is a Muslimah, the marriage is annulled. We agree? We agree? And that's why one of our arguments for Abu Talib's iman was that Fatima bint Asad should have left Islam, should have divorced him. Because Abu Talib, if he's a kafir, Fatima bint Asad should have left. If these ladies are mushrik, or their husbands are mushrik and they become Muslim, their marriage is annulled. Does that mean there is no monthly cycle for them to observe? You have to. Because what if she's pregnant from the ex-husband? So that doesn't mean that you go straight away to somebody. You still have an iddah period. And I mentioned earlier in the discussion that the iddah period differs. Could be half of the free woman, or could be just even a month. And even the wording for the iddah period differs. Well, but the image still looks bad, I think. Because if I'm not living at that time, I can't understand how I can turn up for war and be like, I want her, you give me her. And that's where I think two things. I think number one, we have hadith collections which are very problematic. And some people might say to me, why do you guys always blame the hadith collections? Listen, if there's a hadith collection which is called Sahih Fulan, and in that book it tells me what happened when the wife of the Prophet would teach people how to do ghusl, and how she would tell people about when the Prophet would ejaculate, exactly how she'd wash his clothes, and about how they would be in bed and Jibreel. Listen, when books like that can write these things, they can write other things as well. And I'm not just talking non-Shia books. Sometimes even in our books, there are certain things a person cannot just blindly submit to. A person has to reconcile some of these traditions as well. But the reality is that when you do look at the legal literature, do they become property? Or is there aqd zawaj? There's a big question. Do you agree? Do you ever, from the way I've explained it, I want you to tell me, hand on heart, and don't worry, there's only a couple million people watching you, but I want you to tell me, hand on heart, would you have a problem if it was property? Meaning that milk al-yamin is this reality in Arabian society that if you're going to come, you're going to come to my ends and fight me. If you're going to bring your ladies, you know what the score is. Because these ladies also don't have to be bought here. In some cases, you bring the ladies so the men get a bit, they're on it. So would you have a problem if there was a custom in Arabia that person you've caught in war becomes automatically your property? Would you have a problem with that? Now that I've explained how they all knew what the customs were. It wasn't some random thing of like, okay, now I've caught her, and so on. Would you have a problem with that, with this explanation? Or would you prefer that there is still, there still has to be a aqd, like a nikah, before it's done? Which one would you prefer? So I'm going to use P for property, and I'm going to use A for aqd. We agree? Aqd nikah. Okay? So I'll go around. You tell me either P or you tell me A. A. P or A? Property or aqd? What would you prefer? Property or aqd? Aqd. Okay. A. P. Okay. There's clear Hakim there. Fiqh genealogies. P or A? A. Aqd. P. Property. A. The Africans between themselves, they had all these years of slavery, now they're telling us what should be done. Yasser, B or C? No, I'm only joking. P or A? A. It's very interesting because our moral framework is also very much affected at times by an innateness, and that's a major debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ara and the Shia, that do we have an innate moral system of understanding, or is it what God says has to go? It's a major debate. Although فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا surely gives the direction to innate understanding or morality. لأن, فَأَلْهَمَهَا لَهَمَ is to stick something down someone, like down their throat. As what brings you taqwa and the fujur is as if it's within our nafs. The last verses we want to look at are interesting because there is a mention of nikah related to the slave, but maybe not related to the captive. So if you look, for example, in Surah 24, and all of you, Surah 24, yeah. Surah 24 from verse about 31. 32. Surah 24 verse 32. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's the one that we all hear in weddings. وَأَنْكِحُ. So straight away we have the word nikah, which by the way literally means, nikah in our mosques we call nikah wedding, but nikah literally means physical intercourse. It's very hard sometimes if you're in the Indo-Pak community or Khoja community and you're like, today is the day of the nikah, and as an Arab you're thinking, this just never sounds right. But like for everyone else there, it's wedding. In a wedding we never say, and the Iraqis won't say, come to my nikah, because then the sheikh will be looking at you thinking, you disgusting human being. But anyway, وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ. Marry those amongst you who are single. وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ. And those who are the righteous ones. From who? From your male slaves and your female slaves. وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ إِنْ يَكُونُوا فُقَرَاءَ. If they are poor. يُغْنِهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. It's beautiful ayah. Allah will make them rich. Father-in-law, stop stressing about money. وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Allah is the one who gives the bounties. Allah is the all-knowing. Interesting here, the next verse. وَلْيَسْتَعْفِفِ الَّذِينَ لَا يَجِدُونَ نِكَاحًا. There's an excuse being made for those who can't find someone to be in a relationship with. حَتَّى يُغْنِيَهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finds them a means of getting married. Some people just don't have. Okay? وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ فكاتبوهن إن علمتم فيهم خيرا. What does that mean? والذين يبتغون الكتاب مما ملكت أيمانكم فكاتبوهن إن علمتم فيهم خيرا. So before this we're talking about marriage. Marry the slaves. But if you don't have money, you're excused. Those you possess, your right hand possession, try and have an agreement with them where it's made clear to them a time period where they may be with you and then they may be set free. This is called mukataba. Okay? So it's interesting whether there is an aqd required. Considering the context of these verses is a nikah. But then we move on to this concept of mukataba, a contract between the man who manages the property and the property itself. I'm sorry to talk in such terms, but we're talking 7th century Arabia. This is the customs of the time. Problem with the mukataba is, what if you want terms and your husband, your manager, your owner wants other terms? That could be the only problem. Although the Imams don't want us to take it too long. وَآتُوهُمْ مِنْ مَالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. Give them of the wealth that God has given you. Now, next verse. If we don't do these things, then what problem do we face? Prostitution. This verse. وَلَا تُكْرِهُ فَتَيَاتِكُمْ عَلَى الْبِغَاءِ إِنْ أَرَدْنَ تَحَصُّنًا. Don't force, don't compel your slave girls to become prostitutes when they desire to be chaste. Clearly in Arabia, previous captives, you're going to be selling yourself as a prostitute for me. Suddenly, Islam is saying, slavery is a custom, slavery is a practice, but don't let it get to a stage where you think that this lady has no soul. Rather, build a life with her. Set a time period you're going to be together with her. If she has a child, then that child is free. Many other customs did not allow a child to be free. You are still a slave because your mom's a slave. Whereas for us, the imams, their mothers, even companions of Imam al-Hussein from Karbala, some of them, their mothers were slaves. But when they gave birth to that person, they became walad and they become free. Quran here says, don't force these girls into prostitution. Just because you know you've got this person who you possess the authority over as a property, don't start selling her. And that's where I have to admit, and I'll leave on this note, that when you look at some of our medieval texts on fiqh, and you look at some of the concepts concerning what a master can do with their slave, without a doubt, there were certain customs at some times which couldn't be abolished, other practices that required reform. And others of them, the reality is that only God knows when the right time is, when the human being will not look towards others in this way. Different scenarios meant that maybe slavery calmed when we had the Industrial Revolution, because we looked at these people as workers. So when machines came, we don't need slaves anymore. Maybe it wasn't the human side or the empathetic side. And once again, it remains a legal and it remains a moral issue as well. And we can only look at it and hope for the best for every human being who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whichever way and whichever family you're born into, created you free. Insha'Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. MashaAllah, the holy month of Ramadan is upon us once again. And inshallah, all of your amal will be accepted. Imam Hussein Development and Relief Foundation once again are running the Ramadan Food Basket campaign. Each food basket contains food essentials such as flour, rice, oil, meat, vegetables, tea, lemons, and not forgetting dates. Each food basket is only £20 or $25 and can feed a family of 4 for up to 10 days. You can donate via PayPal, bank transfer, or why not to visit our website www.ihdrf.org. Together we can feed the orphans, the widows, and also the impoverished families all over Iraq.